What is going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. We got a new one for you today. I got the world's cleanest 99 Toyota Tacoma. This thing is a one owner, well, I'm the second owner, but it's been a one owner garage kept, 158,000, I believe, 158,000 miles on it, 2.7 liter, 4-cylinder, and it is an automatic, which I'm not super pumped about, but I mean, it runs and drives perfect, it shifts perfect, so I think we're gonna leave the auto in. But either way, this is a Prerunner. So what we're doing is we're gonna do a four-wheel drive swap. So as far as I know, these frames on the Prerunners are basically the same as four-wheel drive. It's got all the mounts, everything ready to basically just bolt in a differential. We need to swap the hubs out for four-wheel drive, and then we need to obviously add a transfer case and drive shafts. The rear shaft will probably just shorten. I should have the correct front shaft, and I do have all the parts ready for this thing already. So we're about to bring this thing in the shop and tear it apart, put it back together, and we'll be four-wheel drive at the end of this video. Well, here's everything we need to swap four-wheel drive. So obviously we need a front differential. You got to make sure that matches your rear gear ratio unless you're changing gears. This one's got 430s, which was kind of tough to find, but I found a good one. This thing's super clean. I did give it a pressure wash, but it's really clean. Feels really nice and tight and smooth. I do have new seals for it here that we're going to throw in for the CVs out here. There's no leaks. I didn't see any leaks or anything, so we should be good for that. Transfer case is a little bit tricky because 4-cylinder versus V6 are different, and automatic versus manual are different. So I found a 4-cylinder automatic transfer case. You have to get this adapter plate right here, or this little extension housing on the front, and this is actually a forward shift, you can see here, and you got to get the right shifter as well. These are different patterns. It's got to be a 4-cylinder automatic shifter, which was honestly kind of hard to find, but we got it. So transfer case, we got to get in. Obviously we need hubs, so we don't have splines on those for the CV axles in here. So we got all new hubs, we got all new coil bearings, nuts, all new seals and everything to swap that over. And then I needed a transmission or transfer case mount. This one didn't have it on, bolts right here, so I had to find one. OEM, got that. Got a bunch of OEM bolts to bolt on the transfer case, and then it was missing some of these ones here too, so I got some of these bolts for that. And then I'm keeping the automatic hubs. Most people do swap to a manual hub, like the actual dial that you turn, but that's a lot more expensive to get into that with the hubs and everything, so I'm just gonna keep automatic hubs. Just keep it simple, keep it reliable. I mean, these are pretty reliable systems, so it's pretty easy to wire up. We'll do that. I'll show you in depth how we do that. And then obviously we need the console here. It's got the four-wheel drive boot on it. This should bolt in, and I should be able to use my factory automatic shifter in there. It should, I'm hoping anyway, it should go into there. And then front driveline, we got, this is from the same truck as a transfer case, so it's a 4-cylinder automatic. It should bolt right up. And the only other thing we need to worry about is rear drive shaft. Obviously it's going to be shorter now, so I think I'm just going to pull that shaft off and drop it off, have that thing shortened once we get the transfer case in, instead of trying to find a 4-cylinder automatic rear drive shaft, which I have not been able to find. I think I'll just have that one shortened. So like I said, this swap is very easy. There's only one really tricky part. Unless you were to just buy a four-wheel drive transmission, the output shaft is different, and the only difference between the four-wheel drive and two-wheel drive is the four-wheel drive is shorter, and there's no oiling hole in it for the transfer case. So what we got to do, we could probably do this with the transmission in. I think I'm just going to pull it out, because what we have to do is pull the housing off of the rear of the transmission and cut that shaft down. So we got to do some measuring and figure out exactly where to cut that shaft so it fits into the transfer case, and then all we have to do is drill one small hole in the end of that output shaft on the transmission to oil the bearing in the transfer case. So instead of ripping that entire transmission apart, I'm just going to cut it down and drill a hole in it, and it'll be literally the same thing as swapping out a four-wheel drive shaft, except we don't have to tear apart the entire transmission. So let's get this thing up in the air. Let's pull the transmission, get this transfer case mounted up. Once we have that in, I can measure for my rear drive shaft, drop that thing off, and then we can move on to front differential, get that bolted up. That one's super, super easy. All the mounts are in the frame. We just bolt it right on. And then we got to pull the hubs off, pull the whole front end apart. I got new bullet joints, and we got to throw in these 4-wheel drive hubs, all new wheel bearings. And then the last thing to do is we just need to figure out the wiring for these switching solenoids. There's 2 solenoids, one to basically lock in the differential and one to unlock it. So I believe I have a wiring diagram of that. It should be pretty easy to wire up. So either way, let's get to work. Let's get this thing up in the air and rip this transmission out. Well, that wasn't so bad. Transmission's out. Before I tear into this, I want to clean up the transmission and the transfer case. I think that valve cover is leaking on the engine, and it's just kind of running down everything back here. So let's pressure wash this, pressure wash the transfer case, and like I said, we take the yoke off the back here. That is the output shaft, obviously, so we got to take that nut off, pull the yoke off. This rear cover, rear housing comes off, and then our new vehicle speed sensor, that's the one on this transmission. We're going to be extending those wires and using that one there, and then there is the other sensor right here. That does look like the same plug-in, and we may have to swap the sensor itself. I read somewhere they might be different, but either way, that sensor should go in here, so we'll probably swap that over just to be sure. And then all we really got to do is do some measuring here, because we need to get that output shaft to engage in these splines right there. We want full engagement, but we don't want it bottoming out, so we got to be very careful where we cut that shaft off. All right, we're ready to start making our modifications to be able to get the transfer case onto this transmission. So you can see here, there's 2 sensors on this output right here. For the 2-wheel drive, we have the speed sensor for the dash, and then another speed sensor for the actual transmission functions. And this 4-prong wheel here will drive the one for the transmission. We need that one. The spiral one is now going to be right off the transfer case. So you can see this one's all loose now. This was originally held on by the yoke. What we need to do, since we don't need that spiral, and this is where the splines are going to engage into the actual transmission there, we need to cut this off right about at just the edge of that spiral gear, and then we need to put a set screw in there because we're going to lose the splines there to spin it. So we'll do that, get some set screws in there, and then we need to measure basically from the mating surface here on the transfer case, mating surface down into the bottom of that coupler for the drive shaft there, and then we need to make our measurement from here out onto the shaft to figure out where to cut that shaft off. And then the transfer case actually bolts right on. There's these 3 holes on the bottom here on the transmission, but you can see the 2 outer ones are tapped and drilled and everything, but the middle one is not. So I'm going to drill and tap that. I think it's an M10, so we'll do that last. But first, let's get the drive gear figured out, and we'll get that cut and get a couple set screws in that, and then we'll do our shaft, cut that, and then we'll drill and tap this hole, and that should be about all we need to do. And then we can bolt the transfer case right on the transmission. Well, now I'm completely confused. This is not going to work with this shaft. I've seen so many people cut these down and it work. If I were to cut this down where I'm measuring, you can see that white mark right there. That's how much spline I'd have, well, 1/4 inch of splines. I did look at the output shaft for a 4-wheel drive, and it's got splines from here basically all the way up to right at the edge of that wheel there. So it's got, you know, your inch of engagement that sits inside of that little coupler there. So looks like we're swapping the output shaft, which is going to be a ton more work, something I was really not planning on doing. Plus we got to wait for it. So I'm going to figure out how to get this tranny apart. I've never honestly dug into an automatic. I've never really been into automatics, so I've never really worked on them. But either way, I think it's definitely a job I can do. So I'm gonna go do a little research and figure out how to get these things apart. And hopefully, I'm hoping that I can find the correct output shaft. Well, I've been watching some videos on like complete rebuilds on this transmission. I can't find any info on just swapping the output shaft. So I'm not sure if I can leave the pan on, leave the valve body and everything underneath, and just work on that center with all the planetaries and clutches and everything. I gotta pull everything out of the transmission. I'm hoping I can do it without dropping that pan off and tearing everything else off underneath. I'm gonna try it. I don't know if it's gonna work. Like I said, I've never done this and I can't find much info on just swapping the output shaft. So I'm gonna pull a torque converter, bell housing, and start figuring out how to pull everything out of basically the center of the transmission so that we can get access to pull that output shaft off. Everything inside needs to come out. Well guys, like I thought, I figured anyway, the main center section in here is bolted through underneath a valve body. So we got to pull the pan, valve body, and I'm hoping we can just pull those bolts out and that's it. But we will see if that actually will work. Let's pull this pan and see what we got to do to get this thing all the way apart. So far it hasn't been too bad. Found a video that I've been kind of following on a guy taking one apart. So I'm just kind of following that, figuring it out as I go. We'll see if we can actually get this thing apart and back together. Well, here's the 2 bolts we were after for that center little deal that we got to pull out next. So I'll pull these bolts, and then I think this is the main band in there. We'll have to get back under here and pull that pin out there to get that band off. But I want to get this out first. All right, let's see if this will come. Oh yeah, there we go. Maybe. And we're off. Well, we did it. We got the shaft out. I got a new one on the way. So once that shaft shows up, we'll get it installed and get this all back together and see if it's gonna even match the transfer case. While we're waiting for our new output shaft to show up, let's start plugging away on other stuff. So we got differential. I already got this thing set up. I already did new seals. We got all the mounts on. These are all factory mounts. Factory mount there with a factory nut. And I just wanna show you real quick that all the factory mounts are here, right here, and there are the front mounts and the rear mounts right up through that cross member, through that hole right there. So all we got to do, set the differential up in there, bolt it in, and it's that easy. We are done with the diff install. And then we can move to hubs. We got to swap those hubs out, and then we got to figure out wiring for the two VSVs. So like I said, there's one valve that will open the differential and one that'll close. They're basically lock in the diff and unlock the diff. Now how we do that, we just get a relay and we trigger off of the 4-wheel drive switch. I believe it's the front one there. We'll trigger off of that. So when we put it into 4-wheel drive, it will select one of these to open the diff or lock the diff, and then when we pull it out, it'll reverse it and unlock the diff. So pretty easy to do. We'll find a spot to mount these up, run our vacuum lines to the diff, run our vacuum line to the engine, and get that wiring in. And then we still have to figure out the 4-wheel drive light on the dash. I want to get that functioning as well. Well, there we go, front diff is in, looking good. Like I said, this thing bolts right in, so easy to do. Let's drop it down and find a spot in the engine bay for the solenoids for the differential lock, and then we'll run the vacuum lines, and then all we gotta do is figure out wiring. All right, we got solenoids mounted up right down here in the factory holes. They have factory holes on the inner fender, and then I ran across these wires right here, same plugins. I'm pretty sure those are for the solenoids. That's where it mounts factory, and those look like the factory plugs for that. There's blue and brown. Honestly, the wire, there's one wire that's a different color, but I'm not really sure where this harness goes. I don't think it has the entire harness, so I think I'm just gonna wire it, like I said, with a relay and everything. So we'll figure that out. But we got one vacuum line, the one with the little filter right there, that'll go to the intake manifold. And then the two other lines right here go down to the actuator on the diff to unlock and lock it. Well, hubs are good to go. These things turned out great. So now I want to, before we throw these back on, I want to get CV axles in. We got these axles, they're in decent shape, but these inner boots always tear when you have a lift. The outer boots don't really seem to be a problem. It's mainly the inner boots. So I got this set here, which are kind of designed for a lift. You can see that big gap right there in the ribs. What happens is when you have a lift, obviously you get more angle on the CV joint there, and the ribs rub against each other and just tear holes in them. So with that extra gap in that rib there, that is the one that always rubs. So you can see it's going to be much better. I think this will work really good. So let's swap these out for these boots, and then we'll get the CV axles in and get the hubs back on. Well, just like that, we got our spinny things in there that are gonna move some power from the diff out to the hubs here. Last thing we gotta do is drop it on the ground, torque that big axle nut right here, get the cap and all that on, and then still waiting for the output shaft, so we can't do that. While we're waiting, I might jump inside and get that whole console situation figured out, and then we do still have to run some wire, which I may just run some wire right now, but I'm gonna run it up into the console. And then we do have to tear the dash apart to make sure we get the right wire for the four-wheel drive light. So we do have some interior stuff that we can work on while we're waiting for that output shaft. All right, we're gonna move inside now. So shifter, you can see, has transmission here. This is where our transfer case shifter is gonna go with this bezel here. So we gotta get the center console out, get this off, and then there's a plate underneath that's bolted to the floor that we need to take off and cut a big hole in it so we can get that shifter through up into the cab. So we'll do that, and then I'll probably take the instrument cluster out. One weird thing, looks like somebody put white backing on these gauges and the tack must have went out, so they swapped it. I'm gonna fix that. I actually bought new white sticker overlays, so I'll pull the cluster out, but we gotta pull it out anyway because we gotta wire the four-wheel drive light, and I don't think there's a bulb in there. Plus we need to figure out exactly what wire we need to wire that to. So let's do the shifters, get the wire run up to the cluster, get a bulb in there, get everything ready for wiring once we get the tranny back in. Well, thanks Toyota. You can see it's already got marks for where we need to cut this out. So this was a factory little gasket that was on the bottom. We're gonna replace that with the boot. So this will go through the bottom here, but we need to cut that out first. So let's cut this out, get the boot in, we can get this all back together, get the new console in, and we'll be ready for when we get the transfer case. That shifter's gonna go right through into this boot, and then there's that, obviously the interior boot. It's gonna be all factory. You're never gonna know this thing was a pre-runner. All right, we got to build the harness. I already got this drawn up, how we're going to do it, but I want to show you. You got to tap into the passenger side switch. These are the neutral and the 4 low switch, I believe, which I don't think we need to use. We only need this one to trigger the solenoids and to trigger our 4-wheel drive light. So you want to make sure this is in 2-wheel drive right now. You can see there's no continuity. When we put it in 4 high, we get a beep, and then obviously neutral and 4 low, we get a beep. So that's what we want. We want the diffs and the light to engage when we're in 4-wheel drive and not in 2. So this is our wiring diagram. 4-wheel drive light in the dash already has positive power on one side. We need to supply the ground. When this transfer case is in 4-wheel drive, one of these wires is to ground, the other one goes to the light. So that will throw a ground up to the light, illuminating that light. We also need to use that same wire here. We need to split that out, and we're going to run that to our 85 pin on our relay for the VSVs for the front diff. So 85, that's basically our ground for the relay. 30 and 86 will go to a switched ignition power. 87 will go to one VSV. 87A will go to the other VSV. So when you put it in 4-wheel drive, obviously it'll switch the VSVs and unlock or lock that differential. And then the other wire on the transfer case, like I said, goes to ground. VSV wires, the white wire with a black stripe, I believe it is, goes to ground. And like I said, 4-wheel drive light already has power in that cluster, so we just need to supply that ground. So let's get this wiring harness built up. We'll run it through up into the dash and then find a spot to mount our relay for the 4-wheel drive solenoids, and we'll get those wired up. Well, I don't have the other half of this factory plug, so I cut that off, and I'm gonna swap to this Deutsch connector. These are my favorite aftermarket connector. Actually, a lot of factories use these as well, but this is by far my favorite connector to use. So these are just super easy. Strip the wire, and then you just take the pins here, get them in there, crimp them on with these crimping pliers here, stick them into the connection. You got to make sure you get the right pin with the right connector. So the male side connector takes the female side pin, you can see there, like that. This is the female side, so we'll crimp this on like this. I like to give it a little extra pinch, and then you just push these right in to the connector. And then you take this orange one here, stick that in, and we're done. So we'll get this other side wired up with some red, some white for our harness here, and then we can work on the rest of it. Well, I've been digging around in here. I got the fuse box out, and I see a 4-wheel drive fuse right here, 20 amp, and the fuse is in. I checked, it does have ignition power. I'm not sure where that wiring goes, and without tearing it all apart, I'm not going to figure it out. What I think I'm going to do is just use this, add a fuse right here, and we'll stick it in place of that. We'll use this to trigger our relay. This is our power for our relay. Now, I'm not sure if that's used for anything on the truck right now. Obviously, it didn't come as 4-wheel drive, but I think I'm still going to run that fuse. I'll just put that original 20 amp in here, and then I'll add another 20 for our relay for our ADD hubs. So we'll get that in there, get our fuses in, that'll be our power, and then we'll mount the relay. I think I'm going to mount it right up under here, and then we'll just run our wires out to the solenoids and run our wiring up from the transfer case, run it through that grommet there, up to one wire up to there, and one wire. I believe we can tap into the 4-wheel drive light in that little harness right there, but I gotta still figure that out. All right, here's our relay and wiring. So this is gonna go up to the VSVs. There's 1, 2 wires for each, like I said, 87 and 87A off that relay, and then that one's gonna ground both of them. I just got it run up here. I'm gonna ground it right inside. There's a nice spot for a ground there. There's our power into the two, what was it, 86 and 30. And then all we gotta do is hook that up from the transfer case. So let's get this installed. We'll get the plugs wired in for the solenoids, the VSV solenoids here, grounded, and hook this wire up here, and then all we got to do is figure out the light. All right, we got the cluster out. We're gonna find the 4-wheel drive light. Good way to do that, just take a flashlight and come in behind, and you can see right there is our 4-wheel drive. So we have an empty one right there. Obviously we need a bulb there, but a good way to find the wiring is all these bulbs have a common hot. You can see, you just follow these copper strands in this board here, and that's common, that's common, that's common. So we know that side there is the power. This side here is going to be the ground, which is what we're after. We're trying to find that wire so we can supply the light a ground. Like I said, once we shift this thing into 4-wheel drive, this switch will ground out and it'll provide a ground and turn that light on. So we just follow that up here. It looks like it comes in this connector here. So then we'll come into that connector, and I believe that wiring runs down there. We could always tap it in up here. It might be easier just to run it down there. I don't know, it doesn't matter either way, but find the wire, figure out where you want to tap into it, and then we'll tap in the red wire from our switch, and then the white wire we're gonna ground. All right, this is the wire we're tapped into. It's green with a black stripe, and make sure it's the harness going up to the actual cluster. The other side goes out to the engine. So make sure you tapped into the right side. But either way, you got that. And then the other side right here is a ground. So I just got that hooked up to the ECU mount there. Should be plenty enough ground. So all we really got to do, we can test this without the transfer case. We'll just basically make a jumper wire for this connector underneath, basically acting like that switch closes, and that should set off our light. All right, we should be able to throw the key in, ignition on, and I have those wires jump, so we should have a 4-wheel drive light. There we go, look at that. We got that working good. All right, the moment of truth. I found these parts on eBay because Toyota wants $700 for the output shaft. So this guy had an output shaft plus a bunch of other parts. There's the shaft itself right there. Let's see what else we got in here. I think there are some planetaries, some other, yeah, looks like planetary. I don't even know what this stuff's called. That doodad, we'll just call them doodads because I don't know what this stuff is, but either way, we got extra parts, which are probably not in as good a shape as mine. I'm really just after the shaft itself. So let's open this shaft up. It should be the right one. It looks like it. And we'll check out the difference between this one and the one I pulled out. Well, the shaft looks the same from here back, and you can see that white mark right there is where I measured to cut it, which lines up perfect with the end of that shaft. Now you can see this shaft has no splines in here, whereas this shaft does. So this one's going to work perfect as long as those splines are the same. And all these other splines should be the same. Looks like the same oiling holes there. The only real difference I saw, which probably doesn't matter, is this cut for the little clip, little circlip in there. So I doubt that makes any difference. We'll obviously see once we get it together, but this should be the right shaft, and it's already got the tone wheel or whatever you call it for that speed sensor. So the real test, will it fit in the transfer case? Oh, look at that. Same splines. I think we're in business, guys. Let's get this thing back together. That should do the trick. Well, look at that, guys. Somehow we got this transmission back together and we have no extra parts. I think we got this thing together right. And then we also got this hole here drilled and tapped for that extension housing. So now we got to get extension housing bolted onto the transmission. And then the real test, will that thing bolt up to the housing and the splines be the right length? I'm 120% sure that is the correct shaft and that's going to work. Everything went together perfect inside. And like I said, that is exactly where I marked my other shaft where I need to cut it. So I'm 1000% positive this is going to work. So let's get it all bolted together and then we can get this back in the truck. Here goes the real test. Oh, is this thing gonna fit? There we go. Look at that. It freaking bolts on. Now that right there, guys, that is a beautiful sight. We finally have the transfer case mounted up to the transmission. We are good to go. Now this is temporary. I still got to pull this back apart because I want to change the output seal for the transmission. It's basically inside that transfer case. I want to replace that seal, and I got to replace that front seal as well. So I'm waiting for Toyota. They ordered those up, but we are good to go. Everything fits. Once we get those seals in, we'll swap those out, and then we can get this transmission back in the truck. Well, one thing I completely spaced about, which I knew, but I never thought of it, is that this pan is different two-wheel drive to four-wheel drive. The two-wheel drive has a dipstick on this side, and it's in the way of the drive shaft. Plus, it's a lot deeper pan for four-wheel drive. So before I go spend 400 bucks on a new pan, I think I'm going to just fill it up. I'll leave the drive shafts off. Obviously, we don't have the rear yet. I'm getting that shortened. But I want to get this thing running and make sure this transmission actually functions before I go spend a bunch more money. So let's do that. Let's get some fluid in the transfer case, transmission, front differential, and we'll see if this thing even spins. All right, we're all filled up with ATF, got the transfer case all taken care of. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna start it up and let it idle for like 3 seconds, and then we're gonna need to add fluid. We're gonna do that a couple times till the transmission kind of pushes its fluid all the way out through the cooler and through the entire transmission. If the torque converter needs some extra oil, we just don't want to run anything dry in that transmission. And then once we're filled up with ATF, we'll throw it in gear and see if these outputs actually spin. All right, after a couple startups, I think the transmission is filled up enough anyway to let her rip. Fire this thing up, throw it in gear, and we'll climb underneath and see if the drive shafts are spinning. All right, we should be spinning. Look at that, it's spinning. Well, we did something right. We got the rear drive shaft spinning, or the rear yoke anyway. We don't have front or rear drive shafts right now, so kind of hard to test the four-wheel drive if we got those solenoids wired right, because obviously they're not gonna spin with no front drive shaft. So I'm gonna go order up the new transmission pan, and I probably won't get to it in this video because it's gonna take like a week to get here. So I'll throw that in a future video. But I think all that work paid off. I think the transmission is gonna work after all. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you're doing a pre-runner four-wheel drive swap, I hope this helps you out. I kind of wanted to go more in depth on this one just to help you guys out, because I get a lot of questions, especially because previously I did a four-door that was a pre-runner. I swapped out all the four-wheel drive, and I didn't go super in depth, and I had a ton of questions on that, so I figured I'd answer most of those questions on this one, and especially with the ADD hubs. A lot of people seem to struggle with how to wire those and just make a standalone harness like I did. I think that's gonna work out a lot better. So either way, hope you guys enjoyed it. Kind of sucks we can't get this thing all back together and drive it. That pan's gonna take over a week to get here, and the guy for the drive line, he's shortening the drive line, said a week. So I really don't want to wait a week to get this video out. I want to get this cranked out and then start moving on other stuff. So we'll pick up drive lines and the transmission pan in another video. We'll get that all figured out, and we'll get out and drive this thing. I'm really hoping this transmission is going to work. Everything so far seems perfect, so my hopes are high. I think it's going to work. Well, anyways, guys, I'm out of here. Hope you enjoyed it. Why don't you go smash that thumbs up button, comment, subscribe. We'll catch you in the next one.